The light from Vithari mothership turned the whole of the Pacific into a mirror. Sergeant Dara Osi saw it from the roof of what used to be a hospital, in what used to be Lisbon, and she thought, that thing is the size of a country. She had thought the same thing 3 months ago, when the first one arrived. She had thought it again when the second came, and the third, and the fourth. Now there were 11 of them strung across the sky like lanterns at a festival nobody asked to attend. And she'd run out of thoughts about size. Size was the wrong way to measure an enemy that didn't fight with warships or armies or anything a human military had ever trained to face. The Vithari fought with time, not metaphorically, not in the sense of patience or strategy, though they had those too, in abundance. They fought with actual time, with the selective erasure of it, with the collapse of moments that humans needed in order to fight back. A Vithari temporal suppressor could reach down into a 3-kilometer radius and simply remove 6 seconds from existence. 6 seconds, long enough for a missile to lose its guidance. Long enough for a human body to stop mid-stride and find itself 10 meters forward, disoriented, half-fallen, vulnerable. Long enough for a command signal to arrive after the action it was commanding had already been made irrelevant. 6 seconds. That was all it took to make humanity's weapons into expensive furniture. Osi climbed down from the roof when the wind got cold enough to hurt, and found Lieutenant Marcus Baer, sitting in a gutted pharmacy, eating something beige from a can, and reading a printed photograph with the careful attention of a scholar studying an ancient text. She'd seen him do this before. She'd never asked what the photograph was. There was a version of the world, she thought, where you didn't have to ask, because that world had social bandwidth to spare. And privacy was still a thing that people could afford. They were not living in that world. "Tor send anything?" she asked. Bear set the photograph face down on his knee. "Signal's been shredded since 0300. Whatever they did to the relay station in the mountains, it's thorough." He offered her the can. She shook her head. "Chen thinks she can get something through if she re-rigs the old analog transmitter in the bell tower. Wants to use the frequency band they don't bother jamming." "Why don't they bother jamming it?" "Because it's what they think we used to communicate 60 years ago." He almost smiled. "They studied us, just not recently." Osi sat down on what had been a pharmacist's stool. "How long does it take them to update their models?" Chen's guess. "About a month to recognize a new pattern, less if we use it too often, more if we vary it." He picked up the photograph again, still face down, running his thumb along the edge. "She says if we're going to use it once. Use it for something that matters and then throw the frequency away." "And do we have something that matters?" Bear was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't uncertainty. It was the quiet of someone deciding whether to say a thing out loud that they'd been carrying alone for a very long time. "Rise sent something," he said finally, before the relay went down, encoded. "I've been sitting on it because I didn't know what to do with it." O.C. waited. He found Kisper. She stood up. The stool scraped back across the tile floor, loud in the empty building. "Say that again." He found Casper. Bear looked at her now. His eyes were red-rimmed and very steady. "Or something that was Casper, what he left behind, Doctor." Emil Casper had been the world's foremost expert in non-Newtonian temporal mechanics, a field that had been theoretical, almost playfully so, right up until the Vethari arrived and demonstrated that it was not theoretical at all. Within 3 weeks of first contact, Casper had disappeared from the Geneva research facility, where he'd been working, along with every hard drive, every printed page, every coffee-stained notebook in his office. Most people assumed the Vethari had taken him. Some assumed they'd killed him. A very small number of people who had known Casper personally, assumed he had taken himself, and that the disappearance was intentional, and that wherever he was working. Dara Osi had been one of those people. She had been one of them because she had known Casper personally. She had known him very personally. She had known him in the way that involves sharing a small apartment in Zurich for 4 years, and arguing about the washing up and learning the particular rhythm of another person's breathing in the dark, and losing that rhythm 8 months before the Vethari came, when a car on a wet road outside Basel had ended the life of a woman named Dara Casper, née Osei, and left her husband standing at a grave in the rain, wearing the expression of a man who had ceased to understand the point of time. She had kept her name, or rather, she had taken it back. Quietly, at some point during the long, numb months after the funeral, she had started writing Osi again, and nobody who knew her situation had said a word about it. "Where," she said, "old site, the auxiliary tunnels under the Elias." Reyes says there's something down there that's been running for a long time. Something that was generating a low-level temporal signature small enough that the Vettery sensors missed it or didn't recognize it. And Reyes only found it because he stumbled into it literally. His watch ran backward for 4 seconds when he crossed a certain point in Tunnel B. OC was already pulling on her jacket. How long to get there from here? Dara, Bear said it carefully. You're hearing what I'm saying, right? This isn't a rescue mission. If Casper is alive down there, he's been down there for 8 months. If he's not alive, then something he built is still running on its own, and we don't know what that something is, or what it does, or whether walking into it is walking into the only functional human temporal weapon in existence or into something that will remove us from the timeline entirely. How long, she said again, to get there from here? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the photograph from his knee and handed it to her. It was a printout of a surveillance image, grainy and shot at range, of a man in the ruins of what the caption identified as the CERN Auxiliary Facility, Sector 12. The man was wearing clothes that had once been a hazmat suit, modified past recognition. He was carrying something, and he was wearing, over his face and head, what appeared to be a crude animal mask. Pointed ears, long snout, something that in the poor resolution of the image looked almost like the mask of a fox. OC stared at it. Emil Kaspar, her ex-husband, the man who had spent the last year of their marriage so deep inside the mathematics of space-time that she'd felt herself becoming a ghost in her own home, had apparently syndicated into the tunnels beneath the most sophisticated particle physics laboratory in human history, and was walking around in a fox mask. She had not loved him without understanding him, and understanding him, she felt something shift in her chest that was not quite grief, and not quite hope, but was located exactly between them. He's in disguise, she said. Bear frowned. From what? From them. She handed the photograph back. The Vetari scan for human biometric signatures. Thermal, electromagnetic, the specific frequency of the human nervous system under stress. But they also have an exclusion filter. Anything that matches their own scan profile for non-threat entities, they screen out to keep their sensors uncluttered. She paused. How do you know what an exclusion filter looks like from the outside? Bear thought about it. Then, slowly, you're saying the suit is generating a signal. I'm saying that whatever he built down there, he learned enough about how their sensors work to fake the signature of something they've decided isn't worth watching. And he's been doing it for 8 months in a tunnel 20 meters underground. She met Bear's eyes. He's not hiding. He's working. They went at night because that was the only time the Vithakri patrol drones followed predictable paths, and predictable paths could be avoided. Osi, Bear, Chen, and 2 soldiers named Fuad and Miriam Adesanya crossed 40 kilometers of shattered landscape in 7 hours, moving in the particular hunched and careful way that had become second nature to every surviving human on the continent. Staying low, staying quiet, staying in the shadows of ruined things, never moving in a straight line between 2 points because straight lines were what unsophisticated organisms did, and the Vethari had long since learned to watch for them. Chen, who was 23, and had never finished her engineering degree but had an instinct for signals that bordered on supernatural, spent most of the walk explaining to Fuad in a low murmur why the Vethari jamming architecture had a seam in it at exactly the frequency band she'd found, and what that seam suggested about the way the Vethari understood radio communication. Fuad listened with the expression of a man who was not following the technical content, but was finding the confidence of the speaker deeply reassuring. Miriam Adesanya didn't say anything. She was carrying what was, by some margin, the heaviest piece of equipment in the group. A device that had started its life as a soil sampling drill and had been modified by Chen over 6 weeks into something that was either a focused temporal pulse emitter or a very expensive way to bore a hole in the ground. The jury was still out, technically. They hadn't had anything worth testing it on. OC walked at the front. She was thinking about the photograph, about the fox mask, about the particular way that Emil's mind had always worked, the way he arrived at conclusions through routes that felt almost whimsical from the outside, the way he would explain the thing he'd done, and only at the end would the logic snap into place, and you'd see it was never whimsy at all. It was precision that had taken a long way around. She was thinking about what he'd said to her once, 2 years ago, when she'd accused him of being lost in abstraction, of caring more about the mathematics than about the world the mathematics was describing. He'd looked at her with that expression she'd never been able to categorize, not hurt, exactly, not defensive, and said, Everything I do for a reason. You just haven't seen the reason yet. She had not at the time found this comforting. She found it more comforting now. The entrance to the CERN auxiliary tunnels was behind a collapsed maintenance building. Under 3 meters of debris that had been cleared just enough to leave a gap you could crawl through, if you were prepared to accept that parts of your body were going to object strenuously. Fuad went first because he was the smallest. Miriam went last because she was carrying the device, and negotiating the angle of the crawl required both her and Chen to manage it from opposite ends. Inside, it was dark and very cold and smelled of concrete dust and something else. Something that Osi recognized with a peculiar lurch as the smell of the specific brand of coffee that Emil had always bought in bulk and stored in a vacuum canister and drunk in quantities that made his hands shake. There was a faint light ahead, not electric, something more like bioluminescence, a pale greenish glow that came from a series of small objects attached to the tunnel wall at regular intervals. Osi picked one off carefully. It was a glass capsule, hand-blown by the look of it, containing a chemical reaction she didn't recognize. Corked with wax and anchored to the concrete with a bracket of scavenged metal. Beside it, scratched into the wall with something sharp. B12. If you're reading this, come through. Mind the threshold at 200 meters, Osi read it twice. Then she said, "He left breadcrumbs. He knew someone would come," Bear said. He was reading the wall too, his jaw slightly tighter than usual. "No," Osi said. "He left breadcrumbs because he's the kind of person who believes someone will come even when he doesn't know it for certain. It's different." She started walking. The threshold at 200 meters manifested as a feeling rather than a sight. A slight vertigo, a moment where her sense of her own position in the tunnel seemed to slip sideways and then correct itself, like a stumble on a step that wasn't there. Chen made a small sound behind her and said, "Oh," in a tone that suggested she was already mentally redesigning her device. Bear grabbed the wall. Fuad actually sat down. Miriam, carrying the drill thing, walked through without visible reaction, which told Osi something about Miriam. Past the threshold, the tunnel widened. The glow of the chemical lamps became denser, and then there was actual electric light. A string of LEDs running along the ceiling from a source somewhere ahead. Warm amber, the kind of light that said someone had thought about the color temperature and decided that after 8 months underground, warm was non-negotiable. And then there was Emil. He was sitting at a desk that had been assembled from door panels and catering-grade folding tables, surrounded by more paper than Osi had seen in one place since before the invasion. He was not wearing the fox mask at the moment. It was sitting on a hook on the wall beside a full-body suit that combined sections of CERN hazmat gear, Faraday mesh, and what appeared to be panels from a Vethari drone casing. He was wearing regular clothes. He looked thin and extremely awake and exactly like himself, which was the thing that caught her off guard. She had been braced for him to look different, diminished, for the 8 months to show on him in ways that would require reassessment. Instead, he just looked like Emil, which was its own particular problem. He looked up, he saw her. His expression moved through several things so quickly that she couldn't track them all, and then settled into something careful and still. "You found the B12 note," he said. "Chen found your temporal signature. I thought I had it dampened below detectable. She's very good." He nodded, absorbing this. Then he looked at the rest of the group. Cataloging. She recognized the habit, and when his eyes came back to her, there was something in them that wasn't the careful stillness. It was underneath the careful stillness. She had spent 4 years learning to read what was underneath his careful stillness, and she was not going to name what she saw there. Not in front of Bear and Chen and the Adesanyas, not standing in a cold tunnel in the ruins of the most sophisticated research complex in Europe. Not yet. "You need to see what I've built," he said. What he had built took an hour to explain and longer than that to fully understand. And Osi didn't pretend she understood all of it. The core of it was this. In the weeks immediately after first contact, before he'd disappeared, Casper had made a discovery about the Vethari temporal suppression technology that he'd told no one, because the discovery was so alarming that he hadn't trusted the academic communication infrastructure not to reach the wrong people, and because the solution he could see required time and resources and secrecy that he could only guarantee if he vanished. The discovery was that the Vethari temporal suppression didn't erase time. It borrowed it. The 6 seconds that disappeared from human experience didn't cease to exist. They were stored, briefly, at very high energy cost, in a kind of temporal buffer maintained by each suppressor unit, and then released back into the local continuum once the suppressor moved on. This was, Casper explained, with the particular excitement of a man who has had 8 months to develop his excitement to a fine edge, an engineering constraint. The Vethari couldn't actually destroy time. Nobody could. The physics didn't allow it. So they folded it, and holding it folded was enormously expensive. And they could only do it for as long as their power systems could sustain the fold, and then they had to release it. What happens when they release it? Chen asked. She had her notebook out and was writing very fast. Locally, nothing dramatic. The 6 seconds reintegrate. You might feel a slight temporal echo, a sense of something repeated, a stutter in perception. Humans experience it as déjà vu. You've all felt it, everyone had. The Vethari suppression events always left that particular iridescent residue of familiarity behind. But, Casper said, there's a window, between the suppression and the reintegration. A gap in which the borrowed time is in transit, he paused. And in that gap, if you can generate a precisely calibrated opposing signal, the right frequency, the right amplitude buffer, rather than the suppressor directly, you can overload the buffer. Miriam set down the device she'd been carrying. Very carefully. What happens when the buffer overloads? Casper looked at her. The borrowed time releases all at once, not gradually. All of it simultaneously into a very small space. He let that sit for a moment. The suppressor unit experiences the equivalent of approximately 40 years of time in about a quarter of a second. The room was quiet. They age, Bear said. Everything in the suppressor's field ages, including the suppressor, including anything within 6 meters of the suppressor. Casper's voice was completely even. The effect radius is small, but every Vethari vessel is built around a suppressor core, and the cores on the motherships are. He glanced at his papers. Roughly 40 times the power of a field unit, which means the buffer is 40 times larger, which means when it overloads, the whole ship, Osi said. He met her eyes. Yes. Chen made a sound that would have been a laugh in a different context. Fuad sat down again for the second time that evening. The signal emitter, Miriam said slowly, looking at her modified drill. The thing I've been carrying for 2 weeks. Is not quite right, Casper said. But it's closer than anything I've been able to build down here. If Chen and I can work on it. How long? Bear asked. Casper looked at the device. He looked at Chen. Chen looked at the device. They had the conversation that engineers have without speaking, which involves a series of small expressions and head tilts and quantities of doubt distributed between them. 3 days, Chen said. 2, Casper said. 2.5, Chen said. I'm not signing off on 2. Casper almost smiled. For just a moment, looking at him almost smile at Chen's professional stubbornness, Ose felt the specific texture of grief for the life she'd had before. Not the grief of loss, but the grief of recognition. The grief that comes from seeing something familiar in a context that's been stripped of all the circumstances that made it familiar. She felt it land in her chest and she let it land, and she kept her face where it needed to be. 2.5, Casper agreed. They worked in shifts. Chen and Casper took the device, spreading its components across the biggest of the door panel tables, and began the meticulous conversation of 2 people who understand the same problem from different angles, trying to synthesize those angles into a solution. Bear organized the rest of the group into a watch rotation, Fuad and Miriam taking the tunnel entrance while Bear slept. Osi didn't sleep. She told herself she was keeping watch, but really she was watching Casper work. He had a habit she'd forgotten. When he was deep in a problem, he would stop writing and pick up whatever was nearest to his hand. A pen, a scrap of wire, the edge of a notebook, and turn it over and over in his fingers without looking at it, the way some people crack their knuckles or tap their feet. It was a physical outlet for the part of his attention that wasn't usefully occupied. She had found it infuriating once, in the way that intimate habits become infuriating when the relationship around them has begun to fracture. Now she found it. She stopped herself from finishing that sentence. Around 4 in the morning, when Chen had fallen asleep across a fold of schematic paper, and Casper was alone with the device, Osi got up from where she'd been sitting and crossed to his table and sat down across from him. He looked up, put down the piece of wire he'd been turning. You came to find me, he said. I came because you were a lead, a potential weapon. He accepted this without any indication of whether he believed it. How long have you been in the field? Since the 3rd month. I was in Geneva when the suppressor event hit the military command center. I was the only one from my unit who wasn't in the field radius. She paused. I was late. I was walking from the metro and I was late because I'd stopped to buy coffee and I was 8 minutes late. which put me outside the radius by about 30 meters. 30 meters, he said. And a cup of coffee. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't know you'd enlisted. You'd disappeared. She said it without accusation because she had, somewhere in the long months of movement and cold and purpose, burned through the accusation and come out the other side of it. I needed to be useful. The Army needed people with technical backgrounds who could learn fast. It wasn't a complicated decision. No, he agreed. It wouldn't have been for you. She looked at him. Tell me about the mask. He looked back. Then, for the first time, he looked slightly embarrassed. Not much. Just a layer of it crossing his face before the professional control reasserted itself. It disrupts the Vethari biometric scan. The suit generates a false signature profile. Specifically, it mimics the profile of a type of Vethari service drone, a low-function maintenance unit they use for routine inspection. The drones are everywhere in a certain size range. The Vethari sensors filter them out automatically. I got that part. Why the animal face? The embarrassment deepened fractionally. The visual disruption profile works better with a non-human facial geometry. The Vethari image recognition systems are looking for the human face as a primary identifier. The configuration of the eyes, the nose, the proportions. Change those proportions enough and you become significantly harder to flag. I used several different profiles. The elongated face acanid was the most effective. He paused. And I had the materials on hand. The former occupants of this facility had a collection of theatrical props. There was a fox costume. Oz tried very hard not to smile. She was largely successful. Did it work? Twice. 2 occasions where drones came through the upper section of the tunnels and came within 4 meters of me. Both times I was wearing the suit. Both times they logged me as a maintenance unit and moved on. You walked around in a fox mask for 8 months in the dark and it worked, she said. It's not about what it looks like, he said. It's about the signal underneath. He looked at her steadily. Signals often don't look like what they are. From the out to side. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you knew eventually, someone would come. I thought it would be the Vethari, he said. I planned for that. I have countermeasures, fail-safes, a way to destroy the research rather than let them take it. I planned for soldiers coming from the resistance who didn't know what they'd found and might take it apart for components. I planned for people who wanted the technology and would use it in ways I hadn't designed it for. He paused. I didn't specifically plan for you. No, I had a general category that included you, but not specifically you. Another pause, smaller. I'm glad it was specifically you. This time she didn't manage the smile. It came out, small and complicated, and she let it. 2.5 days, she said. Yes. And then we need to get the emitter to range of a mothership, a functional one. The nearest is 2 kilometers from the coast. We'd need to get within. He looked at his calculations, roughly 80 meters. The emitter's signal degrades above that distance in open air. 80 meters of an active Vethari mothership, she said. While carrying a device that's generating a signal their sensors may or may not recognize. Yes, in a fox mask. I have enough materials for 2 suits, he said, and this time, the smile crossed his face without embarrassment and without restraint. And it was the smile she had fallen for in a seminar room in Berlin 14 years ago, and she was 38 years old, and the world was ending, and she was absolutely not, going to process the feeling in her chest as anything other than tactical information about the reliability of her ally. She was largely unsuccessful. They gave themselves 2.5 days because Chen said so, and Chen was right. At the 60-hour mark, they had something that looked nothing like a drill and everything like a piece of Vethari engineering, smooth and angular and faintly humming, which Casper said was correct and necessary, and not a problem, and Chen said was correct, necessary, and slightly worrying, and Miriam said she'd carry it regardless. They went over the plan until everyone could recite every component of it in the dark, which was the only kind of dark they had. Fuad and Miriam would provide cover from 200 meters, using the last of the Resistance's functioning electromagnetic disruptors to create enough sensor noise in the Vethari patrol network for a 2-minute window. In that window, Casper and Osi, in suits, masked, generating maintenance drone signatures, would cross the last 200 meters to the ship's sensor perimeter, get within 80 meters, hold there for 30 seconds while the emitter charged, and trigger it. If it worked, the buffer of the mothership's suppressor core would overload. The mothership, 11 decks, 3 kilometers long, 30,000 Vethari crew, would experience the equivalent of 40 years in a quarter of a second. If it worked. And if it works, Bear said, on the first night of their walk back toward the coast. One mothership. There are 10 more. 11 less 1 is 10, Casper said. 10 is better than 11. And once we know the trigger frequency, we can broadcast it. Anyone with a modified emitter. Any resistance group with the right specifications. He looked at Bear calmly. I didn't design this to be used once. Bear was quiet for a moment. You designed it to be a blueprint. I designed it to be something I could hand to the right people. He glanced at Osi, just for a moment. I didn't know exactly who that would be, but I designed for it. The coast came into view at dawn of the 4th day. Gray water and gray sky, and the vast shadow of the Vethari mothership sitting on the horizon like a continent that had decided to float. Osi had seen it before, but not from this angle. Not with this purpose, not with the emitter humming faintly in Miriam's arms and Casper standing beside her in his suit. Fox mask up and settled over his face. She put on her own mask. The world through the eye lenses took on a faint amber tint, the sensors in the suit that fed her basic environmental data. She watched the amber light of the pre-dawn coast and felt the suit's systems come online against her skin. A low vibration that was the suit, telling her it was generating the signal, the false signature, the maintenance drone profile that might get them killed slightly less quickly than walking in without it. Ready? She said. No, Casper said. Let's go anyway. They went. The walk across open ground was the worst 2 minutes of Osa life, and her life had provided significant competition for the title. They walked at pace of maintenance drones. She had watched Casper practice this, the specific unhurried deliberate pace. Furtive, not aggressive. Just the motion of a thing that has a routine and is following it. She matched him. She thought of nothing except the walking and the breathing, and the amber light through the lenses, and the faint hum of the suit against her ribs. A Vethari patrol drone passed 20 meters overhead. She kept walking. She felt the sweep of its sensor beam across the suit's surface. Felt it not physically, but in the slight flicker of the suit's active systems compensating, maintaining the false profile against the probe. The drone continued past. She kept walking, 60 meters, 50. The shadow of the mothership lay across the beach like a second night, 40 meters. The hum of the ship's own systems was audible now. A vast low frequency that she felt in the bones of her face, the back of her teeth. 80 meters exactly. Casper stopped. She stopped. He held up the emitter. Miriam had passed it to him at the last moment before they'd separated. The lightest transfer. Practiced twice to get the timing right. He held it in both hands and looked at her. She looked back. Through the fox mask with amber-tinted everything and the bones of the earth humming beneath them, she looked at Emil Casper and thought, I am here. We are here. Whatever the next 30 seconds are, we are here for them. He activated the emitter. The charge built quietly, which she hadn't expected. She'd expected something dramatic, light, sound, a visible field of distortion. Instead, there was just the hum, rising slightly in pitch, and the faintest shimmer in the air between them and the ship's hull, like heat haze over summer asphalt. 30 seconds, she counted them. Somewhere behind her, 400 meters back, Fouad was watching the patrol sensor readouts on the device Caspar had built for exactly this monitoring. He would tell them if they'd been detected. He would tell them if the window was closing. If he said nothing, nothing had gone wrong. He said nothing. 20 seconds, 15. The shimmer intensified. The ship's own hum began to stutter. Not dramatically, just at the edge of perception, a tiny irregularity in the vast frequency, like a single wrong note buried in an orchestra. 10 seconds. Casper's hands were steady. 5. She found his eyes, through the masks, through the amber light, through everything. And he found hers. And something passed between them that was not a word and not a gesture, and did not need to be either. He pressed the trigger. The sound the Vethari mothership made was not an explosion. It was closer to a sigh, an enormous bone-deep exhalation, as if the ship had been holding something for a very long time and had finally necessarily let it go. Then the hull plating began to change color, gray to brown to the particular dark amber of very old metal aging decades in seconds. The running lights dimmed and went strange colors and went out. The hum stopped so completely that the silence that replaced it was a physical thing, like a change in air pressure, like stepping from one room into another. The mothership descended slowly at first and then with increasing certainty toward the water. Not falling, sinking somehow, as if the ground had decided it was ready to accept the weight after all. It took 4 minutes for the ship to settle. When it was over, the sea had a new island. 3 kilometers of suddenly ancient metal, quiet and still, already being claimed by the first tentative laps of salt water. Fuad broke the silence from somewhere behind them. "It worked," he said. Not shouted said. In the voice of someone who doesn't quite trust the evidence of their own senses, and is reporting it anyway. Bear's voice came back, equally quiet. "It worked." Chen said something in Korean that her grandmother had apparently said during moments of overwhelming feeling. She translated it later as roughly, "Well, okay then." O.C. was still looking at the ship, at the water, at the gray morning. Casper lowered the emitter. His hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady now that it was done. She understood this. Her own legs were discussing among themselves whether they were obligated to continue supporting her. 10 more, he said. 10 more, she agreed. He reached up and took off the fox mask. She reached up and took off hers. They stood on the beach in the raw morning air, holding the masks, and behind them Chen was already pulling out her notebook, and Beer was already getting onto the analog frequency to call Torres and Reyes and everyone else who needed to know. And Miriam was sitting very quietly on a piece of driftwood, looking at the sunken ship with the expression of someone filing a very significant memory. "I have the specifications," Casper said. "Complete documentation. Every calculation, every modification. I can write it in a format anyone can use. Chen will help." He paused. "And after that?" She looked at him. He was carrying his fox mask by the ear, the way you carry something that has been useful and strange and is now done with its usefulness but not with its strangeness. He looked like himself, thin and very awake and exactly himself, which remained the problem it had been when she'd walked into the tunnel. "After that," she said, "we have 9 more ships. And then we have whatever comes after 9 more ships." "And whatever comes after 9 more ships," he agreed. He said it with the precise inflection of a man accepting an assignment he is not entirely sure he can complete, and is prepared to try anyway. She recognized that inflection. She had fallen in love with it once in a seminar room in Berlin. She had not, in the intervening years, entirely stopped. "The coffee," she said. "You still had that brand." He blinked at the non sequitur. "I found it in the facility storage. A 6-month supply." It seemed like a sign. Of what? He thought about it, genuinely. She could see him thinking about it, turning the question over the way he'd turned the wire in his hands, looking at it from angles. "That some things persist," he said, finally. "Past the point where they should. Past the point where it's rational. They persist anyway, because they're built into the structure of what's left." Osi looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the sunken ship, at the new island the morning was slowly discovering, at the gray water taking its time with the hull, at Bear talking quietly into a handset, at Chen writing, at Miriam sitting in the particular stillness of a soldier who has done a necessary thing. "Get the specifications ready," she said. "We move in 48 hours. 48 hours, he said. She turned to go. Stopped. "Emil," he weighted the mask, the signal underneath. "The thing that doesn't look like what it is." She looked at him over her shoulder. "I know what's underneath." He was quiet for a moment. The morning was getting lighter. Slowly, the way mornings do when they're not sure they're welcome. "I know you do," he said. She nodded once, turned. Walked back toward the group, toward the notebooks and the schematics, and the 9 remaining ships and the analog frequency that could only be used once more before it was burned, toward the very large and entirely specific work of keeping humanity from being erased from its own timeline. Behind her, on a beach in the cold morning, Emil Casper stood holding a fox mask by the ear and looked at the sea. And the sea, for the first time in 7 months, was very quiet.